After my son died, my daughter-in-law stood in the kitchen and said in an icy voice, "You should start getting used to the basement. This house is only for people who are still useful." I looked straight into her eyes. I didn't argue. I didn't get angry. I simply took out my phone and quietly called my brother for help. She thought she had just pushed a useless old man out of his own home. What she didn't know was that that phone call would destroy her entire life. Welcome to the story. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from and what you would do if your own family forced you into the basement of your own home. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Note: this is a fictional story with dramatized elements, but it carries a meaningful and thoughtful message. The first thing I saw wasn't my daughter-in-law's face, but my late wife's porcelain tea set smashed against the wet concrete of the driveway, scattered like bone fragments after a disaster. Silas Vance, a 68-year-old retired bridge inspector, who spent 4 decades looking for cracks in steel, never expected the most dangerous fracture to be inside my own home. My pulse hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I pulled my truck to the curb. They're stacked like a makeshift barricade on my own front porch, were the cardboard remains of my life. My books, my winter coats, and the leather-bound journals I'd kept since the day Kellen was born were all piled haphazardly under the gray October sky. Milo Redmond, a 39-year-old construction foreman with a heavy tread and shiftier eyes, was already moving his gear into my son's study before the body was even cold. He didn't even have the decency to look up as he hauled my favorite leather armchair toward the garage, his movements possessed by an ugly, entitled kind of haste. Bryn Ashford, my 36-year-old daughter-in-law, stood in the kitchen with a forensic accountant's precision, her eyes tracking every dollar and every threat, including me. She leaned against the screen door, her silhouette sharp and unforgiving. "Bryn, what is the meaning of this? Why are my things outside?" I demanded, my voice cracking despite my attempt at composure. "The house is evolving, Silas," she replied without a hint of tremor. "We need the space for someone who actually contributes. A house is like a cantilever bridge. If you remove the counterweight of respect, the whole structure begins to tilt toward the abyss." I felt that tilt now, a sickening slide into a reality I didn't recognize. Before I could find the words to strike back, the door flew open, and 9-year-old Quinn Vance, the only spark of joy left in this house, looked at me with eyes that had seen things no child should ever witness. She rushed toward me, her small face streaked with tears, but Bryn's hand shot out like a raptor's claw. She caught the girl by the arm with a bruising force that made me see red. "Pop, Pop, don't let them." Quinn wailed, her voice a thin ribbon of terror. "Go to your room, Quinn," Bryn snapped, shoving the girl back toward the stairs. "The basement is more than enough for a man who just sits and grieves." Then came the shove. Not a polite request, but a palm against my chest that smelled of Milo's cheap tobacco. I stumbled back, my boots slipping on the threshold I had crossed thousands of times in peace. Milo stood over me now, his shadow swallowing the light from the hallway. "You're an occupant now, Silas, not a resident," Bryn said, her voice dropping to a cold, clinical whisper. I checked the logs. "Your thumbprint access to the main security system has been deleted. I paid for that system." I gasped, the bitter taste of copper filling my mouth from a sudden surge of adrenaline. "You paid for a lot of things that don't belong to you anymore," she countered. Milo gripped my shoulder and steered me toward the narrow, unfinished door behind the kitchen. I tried to resist, but the weight of their combined betrayal was a physical pressure I couldn't overcome. He pushed me through the frame, and I felt the air grow thin and cold. As the deadbolt clicked into place, locking me in the dark, damp silence of the cellar, I realized the medicine Bryn was giving my son might have been the very thing that put him in the ground. The darkness didn't just swallow the light. It tasted of furnace oil and 30 years of forgotten secrets pressing against my lungs as I fumbled for the pull string. My fingers brushed the frayed cord, and a single naked bulb flickered to life, casting long, skeletal shadows across the damp concrete. The air in this Michigan cellar was always cool, but tonight it felt like a grave. I shivered, the cold sinking into my 68-year-old bones as I surveyed what had become my cage. My workbench, the place where I once taught Kellen how to bevel edges and respect the grain of the wood, was buried under heavy black trash bags filled with my own clothes. It wasn't just a mess. It was a deliberate burial. I noticed a thick, heavy tarp draped over the main heating vent, tied down with industrial twine. They had cut off my air and my heat before I even stepped through the door. 30 years of bridge inspections, and I didn't see the rust in my own son's wife. I stood there surrounded by the smell of metallic dust and old blueprints, realizing that the clutter Bryn had been complaining about for months wasn't about the space at all. She had been asking about my files, tracking my movements, and marking the location of my document box with the predatory patience of a wolf. I moved toward the back corner, my boots crunching on grit. A mouse scurried over a pile of rolled schematics, its tiny claws scratching like a ghost in the silence. I reached behind a stack of structural reports for the small metal safe that held the anchors of my life. My hand met jagged cold air instead of smooth steel. I pulled the box into the dim light, and my heart stopped. The lid had been pried back with such violent force that the heavy-duty hinges were nearly severed. The prying tool marks left deep silver gashes in the metal, a physical scream of violation. Every essential document, my birth certificate, my social security card, and the deed to the Michigan property, had been vacuumed out. Most devastatingly, Kellen's final medical reports, the ones I had promised to protect until I understood them, were gone. How many times had I stood on a suspension cable, trusting the math, while my own family was cutting the wires beneath my feet? I sank onto a plastic crate, the stale air filling my lungs like lead. The safe was cold, but the realization that my son's death was a payday for Bryn felt like a hot iron against my throat. They weren't just taking my room or my furniture. They were erasing my legal existence. I looked down and saw a single torn photograph of Kellen lying in the dust. His face ripped right through the smile. Beneath it lay a lone scrap of paper that had fallen from the thief's grasp. I picked it up, my hands shaking. It was a copy of a voluntary power of attorney transfer. At the bottom, staring back at me in bold black ink, was my own signature. It was a perfect replica of my handwriting, a forgery so precise it made my skin crawl. Bryn hadn't just stolen my past. She had used my own name to sign away my future. I realized then that if I didn't reach someone who still believed in the law, I wouldn't just be living in this basement, I'd be buried under it. My thumb hovered over the phone screen, the blue, sterile glow reflecting off the damp basement walls like a cold, digital eye. A smartphone screen at midnight is a lonely sun. And as I stared at my brother's contact name, I realized I wasn't just calling for a detective. I was calling for a lifeline before the current pulled me under for good. I hit the call button, the hollow ring echoing through the dark cellar, bouncing off the exposed rafters and the bags of my own discarded life. My brother Garrett Vance, a 64-year-old retired Detroit detective, didn't believe in coincidences any more than I believed in faulty steel. He answered on the fourth ring, his voice thick with sleep, but sharpening instantly as I began to speak. "Garrett, she's boxed me in the cellar." I whispered, my voice trembling with a mix of shame and fury. "My papers are gone, the safe is pried open, and I think Kellen was murdered." The silence on the other end lasted only a second. "Slow down, Silas," he said, that gravelly, nicotine-stained rasp of his cutting through my panic. "Tell me exactly why you're using that word murder." I explained the eviction, the forged power of attorney I'd just found, and the cold efficiency of Bryn's takeover. To my shock, Garrett didn't sound surprised. He told me he'd already run a preliminary background check on Bryn shortly after the funeral, because her clinical lack of grief seemed statistically improbable for a forensic accountant. He'd seen her type before in the precinct interview rooms, the ones who calculate the inheritance before the pulse stops. Then the furnace kicked on a mechanical roar that sounded exactly like a predator growling in the dark. I jumped, the metallic taste of fear sharp at the back of my tongue. Garrett's tone shifted from brother to investigator, his focus becoming clinical and cold. "Do not touch anything else, Silas," he ordered. "If she's playing for the house, she's playing for keeps. Stay in that basement. Don't confront her, and for God's sake, don't let Milo Redmond see you looking for more clues. You don't know what it's like to realize your son's killer is sleeping 30 feet above you, dreaming of how to spend your life savings." I leaned my head against the cold furnace metal, smelling the dust of decades. "I'll be there by 6, Garrett promised. "Keep the door locked from the inside if you can. We're going to find out exactly what was in those medical files." I hung up, a sliver of hope finally piercing the gloom, but the comfort was short-lived. The moment the blue light of my phone died, the silence of the house returned heavier than before. Then I heard it. A muffled, rhythmic creak of floorboards directly above my head. It wasn't the house settling or a stray cat. It was the slow, deliberate weight of someone standing perfectly still just on the other side of the basement door. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized the floorboards had been groaning under that weight for the duration of my call. Bryn wasn't in bed. She was hovering at the top of the stairs, a silent shadow, listening to every word of my betrayal. The shadow under the door didn't move for 3 long minutes, leaving me to wonder if I had just signed my own death warrant by speaking the truth out loud. The shadow under the basement door had finally vanished last night, but sleep never came. I spent the dark hours counting my heartbeats and wondering if Bryn was standing right outside that wood paneling, holding her breath just as I was. When the first gray sliver of dawn finally cut through the grime of the high basement windows, I heard it. The roar of a Ford F-150 engine didn't just break the morning silence. It sounded like the cavalry cresting a hill I thought I'd be dying on. I dragged my stiff, aching body toward the light, peering through the narrow glass as the heavy tires crunched over the Ann Arbor gravel. My brother's truck slid to a definitive halt, effectively pinning Milo's sedan into the driveway. Garrett stepped out, and even from this low angle his silhouette was unmistakable. He didn't just walk. He occupied space with the practiced gravity of a man who had spent 30 years in Detroit homicide. Milo Redmond emerged from the front door a moment later, still clutching a steaming mug of coffee, his face contorted into a mask of territorial irritation. He looked small compared to the steel and chrome of the truck. Garrett didn't wait for an invitation. He reached into the cab and pulled out a thick manila folder, tapping it against his thigh with a rhythmic, clinical patience. I watched Milo stiffen his shoulders, bunching under his designer fleece, as Garrett closed the distance. "This is private property, pal," Milo shouted, his voice thin in the biting chill of the 6A, Emsier's air. "Who the hell are you?" My brother stopped exactly 3 feet from him, a distance I knew he chose, because it was just outside of striking range but well within the zone of intimidation. "I'm the man who's going to make your morning very complicated if you don't step back," Garrett replied, his voice a low rumble that carried through the glass. Milo was trying to play the part of the alpha, but Garrett was a silverback who had already forgotten more about violence than Milo would ever learn. I saw Garrett flip open the folder, revealing the paperwork he must have stayed up all night drafting. "It's a notice of occupancy rights, Milo. I suggest you read the section regarding immediate family access to jointly owned property before you open your mouth again." The steam from Milo's coffee rose in frantic swirls as he shook his head, his knuckles whitening around the ceramic handle. "I don't care who you are." Milo spat, his construction site bravado leaking through the cracks of his composure. "Silas is moving out, and Bryn wants no visitors. Get that junk heap off the driveway." Garrett didn't flinch. He planted his feet, his eyes scanning the upper windows of the house where I knew Bryn was lurking. "Silas owns 50% of the dirt you're standing on." Garrett said each word a hammer blow. "That makes me his guest, and you a trespasser if I decide to get formal." Have you ever seen a man realize he's brought a knife to a gunfight without a single shot being fired? Milo's eyes darted toward the truck, then back to the house, the realization of Garrett's legal shield sinking in. You can't just barge in here, Milo stammered, his voice rising an octave. This is my room. This is our home now. The slip was subtle, but it hit me like a physical punch. He was already sleeping in Kellen's bed. Milo retreated toward the porch, his eyes darting toward the upstairs window where I knew Bryn was watching, and I saw a flicker of something new in his expression. Not just anger, but genuine, frantic fear. The basement door didn't just open. It was thrown wide, flooding my dark corner with the first honest light I'd seen in days. My brother didn't hug me when he entered that damp cellar. He just looked at the concrete walls with the same hollow stare he used to use at Detroit crime scenes, and I knew right then that he wasn't here to comfort me. He was here to build a case. Garrett stepped over the threshold, his boots clicking with a metallic echo on the gritty floor. He didn't look at my unmade cot or the meager tray of cold food first. Instead, his eyes went to the perimeter. He moved toward the back wall where the old coal chute lived. He reached up his gloved fingers, tracing the seam of the heavy iron door. "Silas," he said, his voice like grinding stones. "This chute has been welded shut from the outside. There's a fresh bead of slag along the hinge." I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. It was meant to be my emergency exit, the one way out if the stairs ever became a gauntlet I couldn't run. Now it was just a sealed tomb. Garrett moved on, ignoring my stunned silence. He stopped by the furnace, sniffing the air like a hound. The smell of ozone and damp earth was thick, but there was something else underneath it, a sharp, acrid scent. "Silas, how long has that heavy tarp been over the ventilation intake?" I blinked, trying to clear the mental fog. "I don't know, Garrett. Bryn said the furnace was leaking carbon monoxide, and it needed to be sealed for my safety." My brother didn't answer. He just pulled the tarp back, revealing an intake vent choked with a thick, sticky residue. Grief is like a structural fracture. It doesn't just hurt, it hides the other rot eating away at the beams until the whole bridge gives way. I had spent my life inspecting the integrity of steel and concrete, yet I had missed the crumbling of my own sanctuary. I watched him kneel by a loose floorboard near the water main. He pried it up with a pocket tool, revealing a small cache of empty, unmarked plastic bottles and a pair of heavy-duty construction gloves. "These aren't mine," I whispered. He didn't look up. He was busy rubbing his thumb against the water pipes. "See this rust, Silas? It's not oxidation. It's a sticky residue from an aerosol spray. This isn't just a dirty basement, Silas. It's a laboratory of slow-motion homicide." The words hit me with the weight of a falling girder. They were planning to wait for me to get sick, weren't they? I asked, the professional shame of my own blindness burning in my chest. Garrett stopped cold. He reached into the rafters above my head and pulled out a black plastic box that blinked with a tiny, malevolent red eye, a baby monitor. He held it up, the LED mocking me with its steady pulse. "She's been listening to every breath, every cough, every word we just said." I looked around the room, the mocking drip of a leaky pipe suddenly sounding like a countdown. My gaze fell on my only water jug sitting on the workbench. Garrett stepped toward it, his face hardening. He didn't just find a bug. He found a line of blue crystalline residue on the lip of my only water jug, the exact same shade as the construction-grade antifreeze Milo used on his sites. Have you ever seen a bridge collapse from the inside, where every bolt looks fine, but the steel has been turned to brittle glass by a poison no one bothered to test? For Garrett sat on the edge of the workbench, the blue-stained water jug between us like a ticking bomb. He didn't touch it. He just stared at the crystalline dust clinging to the plastic lip under the harsh beam of his flashlight. I looked at that jug and felt a phantom ache in my lower back, a dull throb near my kidneys that I had dismissed as the result of sleeping on a basement cot. My brother's voice was cold and clinical, the sound he used when he was processing a crime scene. Silas, he said, his eyes never leaving the blue dust. This residue is a much higher concentration than what they would have used to keep someone chronically ill. Whoever is doing this isn't trying to slow walk you anymore. They're in a hurry to finish the job. I leaned back against the cold concrete wall, the mechanical hum of the house furnace vibrating through my spine. I started telling him about Kellen's final weeks, mapping out the decline I had been too blinded by grief to understand. He told me the water tasted like syrup Garrett. I thought it was just his blood sugar playing tricks because of his type 1 diabetes. He was always thirsty, always nauseous, and his breath, it smelled sickly sweet like overripe fruit. I thought it was diabetic ketoacidosis. The doctor said the same thing. Garrett's jaw tightened. It wasn't his blood sugar, Silas. It was the ethylene glycol. It's sweet, odorless, and perfectly lethal. Calcium oxalate crystals. Imagine thousands of microscopic glass needles shredding your kidneys from the inside out. That's why it looked like diabetic organ failure. The toxicology screen doesn't catch it unless they look for it specifically. She knew exactly what she was doing. She didn't just kill my son. She used his own body to hide the evidence. I felt a visceral wave of shock wash over me, followed by a cold, sharpening fury. Every time Bryn had smoothed Kellen's hair or wiped his brow, she was watching the poison work. She was an architect of shadows, building a house where every board was soaked in rot, and every nail was a needle. Garrett explained that construction-grade antifreeze, the kind Milo keeps in bulk at his sites, is often tinted this specific shade of blue. It was the perfect crime because it mimicked the natural progression of the disease Kellen already had. My mind raced back to the very end, to the small plastic cups Bryn would bring into the room. I remembered the vitamin supplements she insisted on giving Kellen in his final days. She told me they were provided by Milo's construction contact as high-grade electrolytes to keep him hydrated. I had even thanked her for being so diligent. I had thanked the woman who was pouring glass into my son's veins. I looked at my trembling hands and realized I had been drinking from that same jug for 3 days, and the medicine was already in my blood. The realization didn't make me panic. It made me still. I looked at Garrett, and for the first time since the funeral, the fog of my grief was gone, replaced by the hard, diamond-edged clarity of a man who has nothing left to lose but his life. The cellar door didn't just open. It groaned with a warning as a sliver of light from the kitchen spilled down the stairs, framing a small, trembling shadow that shouldn't have been there. I looked up from the blue-stained jug, my heart hammering against my ribs. Quinn Vance, my 9-year-old granddaughter, stood on the 4th step. She looked fragile in her mismatched pajamas, her wide eyes reflecting a kind of hyper-vigilance that no child should ever possess. She didn't look at Garrett, who had instinctively moved into the shadows of the rafters. She only looked at me, her lower lip quivering as the cold, damp air of the basement met the warm kitchen draft. Pop, pop. She whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her small, chattering teeth. Mommy told me not to tell, but the blue syrup smelled like the garage. I felt the bitter metallic taste of rising bile in my throat as I reached out to her. It's okay, Quinn. Come here. You're safe now. She descended the rest of the way, the smell of lavender laundry detergent on her pajamas, a cruel contrast to the scent of industrial solvents clinging to my concrete prison. She told me how she had watched Bryn stirring that same blue syrup into my son's morning coffee for months. Mommy said it was special medicine to help Daddy's kidneys, Quinn said. But she made me taste a tiny drop once to prove it wasn't bad. It was sweet pop-pop, but it made my tongue feel fuzzy. I closed my eyes, a wave of protective fury washing over me. Bryn hadn't just been poisoning Kellen. She had been grooming his daughter to be a silent witness, using a manipulative taste test to ensure the girl wouldn't report the chemical smell. How do you explain to a child that the person who tucked her in every night was the same person slowly snuffing out the life of the man she loved most? I pulled Quinn into a hug. feeling her small frame shake. "Tell me where Mommy keeps the medicine," I urged gently. She looked toward the stairs, her voice dropping to a breathy, conspiratorial tone. "It's behind the soap, hidden in the white bucket with the sticky lid under the kitchen sink." It's a square blue bottle with a bright orange cap. Garrett stepped forward, then his face a mask of clinical disgust. I knew that look. He recognized the description: industrial-grade ethylene glycol used for winterizing heavy machinery. The kitchen upstairs wasn't a place of nourishment anymore. It was the epicenter of a toxic spill that had flooded our entire lives. Quinn admitted she once saw Milo handing a fresh bottle to Bryn in the driveway, confirming the rot went all the way to the core of their partnership. "She didn't just poison him," Silas Garrett muttered, his voice thick with a detective's cold rage. "She made the kid a silent accomplice to her own father's death." Quinn gripped my hand tighter, her small fingers digging into my palm as if trying to anchor herself. Pop, Mommy says we're moving to Florida next week. She said you won't be coming because you're too tired to travel. She says you need a long, long sleep." The air in the basement felt suddenly thin, as if the oxygen was being sucked out by the furnace hum. Quinn gripped my hand, her voice barely a breath. "Nup. Pop, Mommy says you're going to get the same medicine tomorrow morning to help you sleep." I looked at Garrett, and I didn't see my brother. I saw a man ready to burn this house down to save what was left of us. Quinn's warning about the morning dose lingered in the stagnant basement air, turning the yellowed light into something sickly and heavy. Memory is a bridge with missing planks. You can walk across it for years without seeing the drop until a single word from a child fills in the gaps. As I held Quinn, my mind didn't just drift. It plunged back into the antiseptic, sharp smell of the ICU 3 months ago. The rhythmic, mocking beep of the heart monitor was the only soundtrack to Kellen's slow erasure. I could feel the papery, dry texture of his hand in mine as he waited for Bryn to leave the room to check on the insurance. In that brief window of silence, he had pulled me close with a strength that shouldn't have been possible for a dying man. "Dad," he had wheezed, his eyes wide with a desperate lucidity. "Smoke and clocks. Don't let her." Quinn's birthday. I remember the metallic taste of regret that flooded my mouth even then because I had dismissed it. "You're just tired, son," I had whispered. "Rest. We'll fix the house clocks when you get home." I even remembered his frantic look when he asked me to bring his old engineering laptop from the house, a request I had fulfilled, but then completely forgot, leaving the machine buried under a blanket in the trunk of my car until this exact second. Have you ever held a dying man's hand and realized too late that he was trying to hand you a weapon? The realization hit me with the force of a structural collapse. Kellen wasn't rambling about household chores. He was a civil engineer who spent his life designing fail-safes. He wasn't confused. He was leaving me a map. I pulled away from the memory and looked at Garrett, the analytical urgency rising in me like a tide. He wasn't rambling, Garrett. Smoke and clocks. He was talking about the house, the smoke detectors and the grandfather clock in the living room. They aren't just fixtures, they're vantage points. Kellen was a tech-obsessed engineer. He'd have known how to install pinhole lenses where no one would ever think to look. Then it hit me. May 15th. 05-15-05. The key to the kingdom. That's the code to his cloud server, Garrett. It's Quinn's birthday. He didn't just die. He built a trap for the woman who was killing him, and he gave me the combination in the only way he knew she wouldn't understand. An engineer to the end, Garrett muttered, his posture shifting from protective to predatory. He knew we'd need eyes where he couldn't be. I realized then that Bryn had been standing right there in the ICU during that whisper. She had heard the same words I did, but she had interpreted them as the final broken static of a failing brain. She hadn't looked for the cameras because she thought her husband was already gone before his heart even stopped. She didn't know the recording was still running. I looked up at the basement ceiling, knowing that directly above us, Those tiny glass eyes were still recording every move Bryn made, waiting for me to hit play. Waiting for a killer to leave her nest is a special kind of agony, like standing on a bridge you know is rigged with explosives while holding a stopwatch in your sweaty palm. We didn't need a search warrant. We needed a 3-hour window and a clear path to the grandfather clock. Garrett and I huddled in the corner of the basement, the smell of stale coffee and basement mold thick in the air as I relayed the house's floor plan with the precision of a blueprint. I pointed toward the ceiling, tracing the path for him. "We have 2 primary targets," I whispered. "The smoke detector in the foyer and the grandfather clock in the living room. That's where Kellen would have put the eyes." Garrett checked his watch, the tactical light of his digital display casting a sharp glow on his weathered face. He leaned in his voice, a low, steady rumble. "She leaves at 8 sharp for that meeting with the estate liquidator. We have until 11 before she even thinks about coming back. If the server is locked, we take the physical units. We don't leave without the truth." I watched him reach into his jacket and pull out a small device. "I've already disabled the exterior Wi-Fi bridge to the security company," he noted. "It ensures that Bryn won't receive any motion alerts on her phone while we're moving around upstairs. She'll think the system is just glitching again." The sun began to bleed through the basement grime, illuminating the frost on the window pane and signaling the start of the most dangerous day of my life. A civil engineer builds to withstand the wind, but a retired bridge inspector knows that sometimes the collapse starts from a single quiet vibration. We sat in silence, listening to the house wake up. The sharp, rhythmic click of Bryn's heels began to march across the hardwood above our heads, the sound of a predator preparing for her day. I moved to the narrow window, peering out, as the driveway gravel crunched. Milo Redmond was already there, helping Bryn load several of Eleanor's antique Wedgwood vases into the trunk of their car. "There goes the last of the family history," I muttered, watching them strip the house bare. "Let her," Garrett said, standing up and adjusting his stance. "Every vase she steals is another nail in her coffin once we get that footage." Click. The car door shut. The countdown to the truth began now. I held the cold, heavy weight of my stopwatch, my thumb hovering over the start button. I watched as Bryn walked around to the driver's side. As she pulled away, I caught a glint of silver against her black sweater. She was wearing Kellen's Michigan-class ring on a chain around her neck. It wasn't a memento of love. It was a trophy from the man she had systematically erased. The distant, fading hum of the car engine was the only sound left in the world. The gravel crunched under her tires as the car vanished around the corner, leaving the house silent, and for the first time in months, the door at the top of the basement stairs was left unlocked. I looked at Garrett, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. We didn't have to wait anymore. The bridge was clear, and the 3-hour clock was officially ticking. The kitchen didn't smell like my home anymore. It smelled like expensive bleach, and the clinical absence of my son, a crime scene scrubbed so clean it made my skin crawl. The air was thick with the scent of lemon-scented floor wax, a sharp, artificial sweetness that felt like a slap in the face. I led Garrett through the unlocked basement door, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Every creak of the Victorian floorboards sounded like a gunshot in the vacuum of the empty house. I felt the cold, slick feel of latex gloves on my sweaty palms, a reminder that we were ghosts in our own halls. As we passed the pantry, my eyes caught a glint of something near the frame. I stopped, my breath catching. A single strand of blonde hair was taped across the pantry door, almost invisible. Bryn had set physical traps. She wasn't just relying on my grief to keep me in the basement. She had designed a system to know if I ever dared to cross the threshold. "Keep your gloves on." "Silas Garrett," whispered his voice, a low, urgent rasp. "Don't leave a single trace that we were ever up here." I nodded, though my throat felt tight. "It feels like I'm breaking into a stranger's house, Garrett. I built these walls. I knew every knot in the wood, every settling groan of the foundation, but the soul of the place had been surgically removed. I looked toward the sink where Quinn said the blue bottle was hidden, but Garrett shook his head. He gestured toward the living room, signaling that the digital eyes were our priority. Hardware is secondary to the cloud, he mouthed. Have you ever stood in a room you've lived in for 40 years and felt like a ghost haunting your own dinner table? That was the living room. Eleanor's touch was gone. The family photos that used to line the mantel had been swept away, replaced by modern, soulless art that looked like it belonged in a high-end dentist's office. It was a blank slate for Bryn's new life built on the rubble of mine. We reached the grandfather clock, its steady tick-tock sounding like a countdown to our discovery. The bitter metallic taste of adrenaline flooded my mouth. Tick-tock. Every second was a debt I owed to my son's memory. Garrett began to examine the dark mahogany casing with a flashlight, his movements surgical. There, he whispered, pointing a gloved finger, just above the Roman numeral 12. That's a lens, Silas. He really did it. I replied, a surge of awe cutting through my terror. He turned the history of this family into a witness. Garrett reached into the side panel, his eyes widening as he inspected the interior. Silas, he's rigged this to a separate battery backup. Even if she'd cut the house power to hide her tracks, this thing wouldn't have missed a beat. Kellen had been thorough. He had planned for a darkness I was only just beginning to comprehend. The oppressive silence of the house seemed to press against my eardrums, heightening every external sound. As Garrett reached for the clock's panel to retrieve the storage unit, the silence was shattered. The front door handle rattled a sharp mechanical grinding, and the heavy oak frame groaned against its hinges as someone applied pressure from the outside. We froze, our breath held so tight, it felt like our lungs would burst. Adrenaline is a bitter metallic flood, and as I pressed my back against the cold mahogany of the grandfather clock, I realized I was holding my breath so hard, my vision began to swim in the silent house. The handle rattled once more. Then a heavy thud echoed through the door as a package was dropped onto the porch. Through the narrow sidelight of the foyer, I watched a man in a courier uniform step back. He didn't just walk away, though. He pulled out a smartphone and began methodically taking photos of the perimeter, his lens lingering on the basement windows. I realized then that he wasn't just a delivery man. Bryn had hired private security to monitor the basement occupant. The man's heavy footsteps finally retreated down the porch steps, and I felt my heart restart with a painful thud against my ribs, cold sweat dripping down my spine. It was just a delivery, Silas Garrett whispered, though his hand remained on the grip of his service weapon. Breathe. He tried the handle, Garrett, I rasped. They're all watching this house like vultures. My brother didn't waste a second. He signaled for me to help him with the clock, and we worked in frantic sync. We opened the hidden compartment tucked behind the pendulum weights, the heavy metallic ticking of the clock echoing in the empty hall like a judgmental heartbeat. Garrett extracted a palm-sized black box, the primary storage hub. We moved with feline quiet into the kitchen, the smell of bleach still cloying. I stood on a kitchen chair, my hands shaking, as I reached for the smoke detector. With a dry plastic snap, I twisted the casing to reveal the blinking red eye Kellen had left behind. The clock and the smoke, I murmured. Kellen was a bridge designer. He knew exactly where the blind spots were. How many times had I inspected a bridge and missed the hairline fracture that would eventually bring the whole structure down? I had missed the cracks in my own family, but my son had seen them clearly. We retreated to the small study at the back of the house. I pulled the engineering laptop from my trunk bag, the scent of ozone rising as it booted up. My fingers hovered over the keys before I typed the code 051505. May 15th, the day Quinn was born. Password accepted, Garrett whispered. The cloud is loading, Silas. 47 files. The screen flickered. A blue progress bar crawled across the monitor like a digital snake mocking the speed of my own racing pulse. I stared at the list of encrypted video files, my eyes landing on the very top of the directory. There was a folder labeled in Kellen's precise technical font for my father. Open immediately. He knew I whispered the realization cutting deeper than any blade. He knew I'd be the only one smart enough to find it. The thumbnail of the first video appeared as the sync completed. It wasn't just a recording of the kitchen. It showed Bryn standing at the counter, her back to the camera. She was holding a syringe over my son's insulin vial, her face turning toward the light with a smile that I will see in my nightmares until the day I die. My son wasn't just sick. He was being executed in his own home. Garrett reached over my shoulder and hit play, the click of the mouse sounding like a hammer falling on a nail. The play button was a small white triangle, but as I clicked it, I felt like I was pulling the trigger on a weapon that had been aimed at my son's heart for months. The blue electronic glare of the laptop screen illuminated the cold, unmoving air of the study. The timestamp on the file read April 14th, 2024. On the screen, the kitchen I had just walked through appeared in high-definition clarity. Bryn was alone, her movements efficient and devoid of any hesitation. I watched my throat tight as she pulled a blue industrial bottle from beneath the sink. She didn't look around or act nervous. She had the cold, analytical focus of a predator checking its traps. She used a precise measuring dropper to draw out the ethylene glycol, the liquid glowing a faint, malevolent blue in the morning light. She added it to Kellen's favorite ceramic mug, stirring it with a silver spoon until the tint vanished into the dark roast coffee. Even more chilling was her attention to detail. She picked up a bottle of sugar-free creamer, checking the calorie count on the label before adding it to the mug, ensuring the extra sweetness of the antifreeze wouldn't cause a blood sugar spike that might alert his glucose monitor. "Look at her hands," Silas Garrett whispered. "Not a single tremor. She's done this before." I could only stare at her mouth. "She's humming," I rasped, the bitter, dry taste of hatred filling my mouth. "My son is dying in the next room, and she's humming a lullaby to herself." Watching that video was like inspecting a bridge as it crumbled in slow motion, seeing every rivet pop and every beam buckle while the architect stood by and smiled. Kellen entered the frame then. His digital voice sounded tinny but was so full of life, it felt like a ghost had walked into the study. He looked healthy but tired, leaning against the counter and rubbing his eyes. He thanked her for taking such good care of him while he struggled with his engineering project deadlines. He took a long, appreciative sip from the world's best dad mug. I saw the exact moment the poison entered his system, a death sentence delivered with a gentle, supportive smile. She kissed him. The woman who just poured liquid death into his cup kissed him like he was the only man in the world. As she pulled away, she looked directly toward the Roman numeral 12 on the grandfather clock. She didn't know the lens was there, but she was looking for a witness to her own perfection. 47 files, Silas Garrett said, his grip tightening on my shoulder. "We're not just watching a murder, we're watching an autopsy in reverse." I leaned closer to the screen, my eyes catching a glint in the background. In the polished reflection of the microwave door, I saw a second figure. Milo Redmond was standing in the mudroom, leaning against the doorframe and watching the entire execution with his arms crossed. He wasn't just a bystander. He was the foreman on this job. I didn't need to see the other 46 files to know the truth. But then Garrett pointed to the next thumbnail. It was time-stamped just 3 days ago, and it showed Bryn standing at the basement entrance with that same blue bottle in her hand, looking down toward where I slept. We didn't breathe. We just clicked the next file, descending further into the mechanical heart of Bryn's betrayal. There is a specific kind of evil that doesn't just want you dead, but wants you to spend your final hours believing you've lost your sanity. And I watched it unfold in high definition on my son's laptop. I bypassed the recent thumbnails of myself in the basement and clicked a file from May 2024. The camera in the kitchen captured Bryn alone at the counter with Kellen's insulin kit. The sterile click of the syringe was haunting in the cold, unmoving air of the study. With a steady hand, she drew the life-saving medicine out of the vial and replaced it with clear saline. I realized then that the saline she used wasn't just salt water. She'd added a low-grade irritant to the mix. It was a calculated move to ensure Kellen felt a sharp sting when injecting, making him believe the medicine was real and potent. She was meticulous, checking the light through the glass to ensure no air bubbles betrayed the swap. She's not just poisoning him with the blue syrup. I rasped the metallic taste of a suppressed scream coating my throat. She's taking away his shield. Garrett nodded grimly, his face illuminated by the blue glare of the monitor. Celine. It does nothing to stop the blood sugar spike, Silas. She's letting his own body eat itself while she watches. The footage jumped forward an hour. Kellen entered the frame looking frantic and gray. He was checking his continuous glucose monitor, which was emitting a faint, desperate alarm. I watched my son, a brilliant engineer who had designed bridges and systems of complex logic, start to panic as the blue glare of the monitor showed a reading over 400. How do you fight an enemy who has convinced you that you are your own greatest threat? He was gasping, his ragged, panicked breathing filling the room as he showed the device to Bryn. I took it, Bryn. I know I took it. Why is this happening to me? Bryn stroked his arm, her voice a soothing poison, as she told him he must have forgotten to take his dose. She suggested his confusion was getting worse, a symptom of the very diabetes she was weaponizing. I watch my son start to weep, truly sob, because he thinks his brain is failing him before his 39th birthday. She smiled, while he sat there sobbing, convinced he was losing his mind. She looked at the grandfather clock and smiled. It was the same look I'd seen on her face in the previous video, a predator acknowledging her own masterpiece. After Kellen stumbled out of the kitchen to lay down, Bryn remained. She picked up his phone, her thumb moving with practiced ease across the screen. I watched as she deleted the low insulin alerts from his medical app, erasing the digital trail of his struggle before he could even think to show a doctor. I realized then that the smoke and clocks weren't just for her. Kellen was recording his own descent, because even as his mind was being broken, his engineer's soul knew the math didn't add up. He knew something was wrong with the system, and he'd turned his entire house into a diagnostic tool to find the failure point. The realization of how Bryn broke Kellen's mind before his body failed hit me like a physical weight settling deep in my bones. The next 3 files were a blur of gray skin and sunken eyes, a time-lapse of a man being hollowed out from the inside. Watching your only child wither and fast forward is a torture. No engineer's logic can fix a time-lapse of a bridge losing its supports until the center span just vanishes. I scrubbed through the files from late May to early June, watching the vibrant 38-year-old man I raised disappear in grainy, low-light flickers. On screen, Kellen's skin turned the color of damp ash. His hands began to shake so violently he could barely hold a pen, and his athletic frame shrank until his clothes hung off him like rags on a scarecrow. In one particularly gut-wrenching clip, Kellen lost his footing and collapsed near the kitchen island. I watched with a mounting nauseous dread as Bryn entered the frame. She didn't offer a hand. She didn't even pause. She casually stepped over my son's prone body to reach the wine fridge, selecting a bottle with the detached calm of a woman browsing a library. Garrett leaned in, pointing at the screen. Look at the neurological tics, Silas. The twitching eyes, the slurred speech. That slurred mumble isn't diabetic shock. It's the ethylene glycol finally reaching the brain. Stop it, Garrett, I whispered, the cold, dead weight of the mouse heavy in my hand. I can't watch him crawl across his own kitchen floor anymore. Look at the date, Silas, he countered, his voice like iron. This was 2 days before he was admitted. She was watching him die while she made shopping lists. 82 pounds. That was the weight loss recorded in his medical file. Seeing it in person was like watching a ghost try to inhabit a living man. I felt the old engineering laptop overheating against my legs, the smell of hot plastic and dust mingling with my own cold sweat. Then we found the final healthy footage. It was early June, and for a brief, flickering moment of clarity, Kellen looked directly into the smoke detector camera. He didn't speak. Perhaps he knew the audio was too risky, but he held up his engineering notepad to the lens for 3 long seconds. It was a frantic, scribbled list of calculations, a geometric proof that his insulin-to-carb ratio made no mathematical sense. Even as his organs were failing, my son was leave-taking with the only language he trusted, mathematics. He knew. Look at his eyes, Garrett. He was saying goodbye to me through a pinhole lens. He wasn't just a victim, Silas. He was the lead investigator on his own murder. If you think you know the limits of human cruelty, you haven't seen a woman fix her hair in a reflection while her husband dies at her feet. In a sickening coda to the clip, Bryn tilted her head, adjusted her blonde waves, and snapped a smiling selfie with the struggling Kellen blurred in the background. She was documenting the harvest. I closed the video player, my hands vibrating with a rage so cold it felt like ice in my veins. I wanted to scream, but the silence of the house was too heavy. Then Garrett's fingers danced across the trackpad, finding a hidden partition. He found the audio folder, the one that contained the recorded conversations Bryn thought were private. My heart didn't just beat, it hammered. The audio files didn't have pictures, but the voices were enough to make the room go dark. Voices are harder to scrub than video. They carry the vibration of a soul's rot, and as the first recording hissed to life, I realized I was about to hear my own death warrant discussed with the casualness of a grocery list. I played an audio file time-stamped May 22nd, 2024. Through the low hiss and crackle, the voices of Bryn and Milo emerged sharp and clear. They were in the living room, probably sitting in the very chairs I had picked out with Eleanor. Bryn's tone was businesslike as she discussed the timeline for the transition. She spoke about Kellen's life insurance policy and the equity in this house as their Florida retirement fund. The payout should be double if the secondary policy clears, she said. Kellen's heart was always a known risk, remember. Milo let out a low, guttural, wet laugh that made the ice-cold sweat prickle on my neck. Florida's going to suit us, Bryn. No more snow, no more pretending to like the old man. I stared at the screen where a folder of Tampa real estate brochures sat open, realized they had been intercepting my mail for months. They had even hidden a letter from the insurance company questioning the natural cause of my son's death, a lifeline I never knew existed. Have you ever heard someone laugh at the thought of your lungs failing while they sit in your favorite armchair? The recording from late September was even worse. Bryn's voice had turned clinical, describing my supposed confusion and declining health to her partner. She was laying the groundwork to move me to a state-run facility, a place she noted where accidents happen frequently to the elderly. Silas is a bridge inspector, she said. He's used to looking for cracks. We can't let him find the ones we made. Milo didn't hesitate. Don't worry, he replied. By the time he realizes the water tastes sweet, he'll be too weak to scream. One more diabetic-looking tragedy in the family won't raise eyebrows if the first one passed as natural. Sweet. They said the poison was sweet. That was the last thing my son ever tasted. I felt the metallic, dry taste of terror in the back of my throat, but it was quickly replaced by a protective rage. The audio continued with Milo bragging about how he had purposely sabotaged the basement ventilation months ago. He wanted to ensure I would inhale industrial fumes, weakening my lungs, and making the eventual respiratory failure from the ethylene glycol look like a pre-existing condition. He spoke of my breathing like it was a technical flaw in a construction project. I didn't need to hear any more. The rot was absolute, but the paper trail was just beginning. My hand shook as I clicked on a final non-audio file at the bottom of the list. It was a scanned document titled Final Will of Silas Vance. As I opened it, the room seemed to tilt. There at the bottom of a page that left everything, the house, the savings, and the full custody of Quinn to Bryn Ashford, was my own signature. It was a perfect forgery, a legal cage built to trap my granddaughter long after I was gone. The realization that they weren't just killing me, but stealing Quinn's future, made my vision go white with a fury that finally surpassed my fear. I didn't need to hear anymore. The rot was absolute, but the paper trail was just beginning. Seeing your own name typed into a search bar, followed by symptoms of early-onset dementia and how to force a psychiatric hold, is like watching someone measure you for a coffin while you're still breathing. I leaned over Garrett's shoulder as he scrolled through Bryn's browser history. It was a clinical map of my scheduled destruction. She had been researching Michigan's involuntary commitment laws with the same cold intensity she used for the poisoning. I watched the cursor hover over a hidden folder on the cloud drive titled Doris. Inside, we found the wire transfer receipts stark, digital evidence that my daughter-in-law was funneling the $240,000 she'd borrowed from me directly to her mother's account in Tampa, while Kellen was still gasping for air in the hospital. She's building a cage of words, Garrett. I whispered, my voice thick with righteous indignation. She's telling the world I'm a danger to myself, and my memory is gone. Garrett nodded, his fingers flying across the keys as he copied the entire drive to an encrypted USB stick that smelled faintly of fresh ozone. It's a standard predatory maneuver, Silas. She needs you declared incompetent so that forged will become gospel. If you're a madman, your signature on that new will is just a symptom, and your protests are just delusions. I stared at a draft email she'd written to a local psychiatrist. In it, she described my erratic behavior and violent outbursts, complete fabrications designed to strip me of my legal agency before the anti-freeze could finish its job. How many bridges have I seen fail because of a single hidden flaw that everyone assumed was just a surface scratch? This house was failing, and I was the flaw she was trying to sand away. Garrett finished the data retrieval at 10:45. We moved with the practiced silence of burglars, meticulously restoring the smoke detector and the grandfather clock panel. I made sure every screw was turned to its original tension, my eyes scanning the floor for any disturbed dust. Vroom. The mechanical whine of the garage door rumbled through the floorboards. The predator was back in the nest 15 minutes early. Go, Silas! Back to the cot! Garrett hissed, shoving the USB stick into his pocket. I'll hide behind the furnace. I slipped back down the basement stairs, the cold, damp darkness returning to greet me like an old friend. I engaged the internal bolt just as I heard the muffled sound of Bryn's keys hitting the kitchen counter upstairs. I moved toward my workbench, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Then I saw it. A fresh glass of water was waiting for me on the workbench, perfectly placed. I leaned in, and there it was, a faint, telltale blue ring around the bottom that wasn't there when I left. She had been busy while she was out. I sat on my cot and watched the dust motes dance in the light as the basement door handle rattled from the outside, wondering if Bryn was coming down to offer me a glass of water or a final goodbye. The adrenaline was a sharp electric current under my skin, but I kept my face slack and my eyes dull. I had the truth in a plastic stick in my brother's pocket, and for the first time in months, I wasn't the one who should be afraid of what comes next. The walk to Jonathan's office felt like crossing a suspension bridge during a gale, but for once. I knew the structural math was on my side, and the anchor bolts of the law were finally being tightened. We had slipped out of the Victorian estate under the heavy shroud of a Michigan midnight, avoiding the sensors Milo had surely recalibrated. By the time the sun began to burn through the fog, we were standing outside the sanctuary of the law. Jonathan Reeves, my 70-year-old attorney, and a man who wore integrity like a bespoke suit, sat behind a mahogany desk that had seen more family secrets than a confessional. The room smelled of old parchment and expensive leather, a sharp contrast to the damp concrete of my basement prison. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the encrypted USB stick, placing it on the desk with a hand that finally felt steady. Jonathan, I'm not here for probate, I said, my voice low and gravelly from the bitter taste of day-old coffee. I'm here because my son was executed in his own kitchen. Jonathan's professional composure, usually as unyielding as a granite monument, visibly cracked. He had known Kellen since the boy was in diapers, and the sheer horror of my words left him breathless. He revealed that Kellen had actually visited this very office 2 weeks before his death to update his will, but he had left abruptly before signing. It was clear now that my son suspected Bryn was monitoring his every legal move. "Silas, if what you're saying is on this drive, we aren't just looking at a lawsuit," Jonathan whispered. "We're looking at the gallows. Have you ever seen a man of the law realize that the scale of justice hasn't just been tipped, but completely dismantled by someone he once trusted?" That was Jonathan in the moment he heard the cold, metallic click of the USB stick entering the port. We sat in a silence broken only by the rhythmic, heavy ticking of the office clock, which seemed to mock the time we had already lost. He opened the first video file. The blue light reflected off Jonathan's glasses, illuminating a face that went from skepticism to a deathly waxen pale as the high-definition footage of the poisoning played. The monitor flickered. The poison flowed. The law finally woke up. Jonathan didn't even wait for the clip to end before he was white-knuckling the receiver of his desk phone. "The district attorney needs to see this by noon," he snapped, his professional resolve hardening into a weapon. "We need a court order for the cemetery before sundown. She thinks she's safe because the death certificate says natural causes. But we're about to rewrite history." As he began scrubbing through the secondary directories, his eyes narrowed at an audio file. He hit play, and Bryn's voice filled the room, bragging to her mother about how Jonathan himself was too old and senile to notice the discrepancies in the estate liquidations. Jonathan's jaw set so tight, I thought his teeth might shatter. He continued to navigate the drive, his movements becoming more frantic, until he stopped dead on a hidden folder. He gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles white as bone, and whispered, "Silas, there's a second folder here. It's not about Kellen. It's a list of offshore accounts in your name that you never opened." The room went cold. I realized the betrayal hadn't just taken my son's life. It had turned my own identity into a vehicle for their theft. The numbers on the spreadsheet didn't just represent money. They were the sonar pings of a theft that went deeper than I ever imagined, vibrating through the screen like a heartbeat from a ghost. I sat in the cold, stagnant air of Jonathan's office, the blue, hypnotic flicker of the monitor illuminating the lines of my face as we descended into the forensic rot. My hands were balled into fists resting on the mahogany desk that felt like the only solid thing in a world turned to liquid. Jonathan pulled up a series of wire transfers initiated from Kellen's accounts, just hours after his time of death was recorded. I watched the timestamps, my vision blurring with a metallic taste of $250,000 betrayal. She moved $250,000 while I was still picking out his burial suit, Jonathan. The dry smell of laser-printed paper filled the room as he printed out the evidence. We found 4 separate loans totaling $240,000, all secured, using my forged signature as a co-guarantor and Kellen's engineering firm as collateral. It wasn't just a grab for cash. Jonathan discovered that Doris Hargrove had been receiving consulting fees from Kellen's firm for over 2 years. Bryn had been siphoning his lifeblood long before she decided to end it. "She used your credit score to anchor the debt, Silas," Jonathan said, the sound of a heavy stapler punching through files punctuating his grim assessment. "If she had succeeded, you would have been homeless within a year. How do you quantify the cost of a life when every dollar sign is etched into the suffering of your own child?" I felt a cold, analytical fury taking hold, the kind of clarity that comes when you finally see the structural flaw that caused the collapse. We traced the final destination of the stolen funds to a shell company in Tampa, Florida, titled DH Management. Jonathan cross-referenced the registration and found it belonged to Doris Hargrove, Bryn's mother. I realized then that this wasn't a solo act. It was a generational harvest, a daughter sending the spoils of her kill back to the woman who taught her how to sharpen the knife. Doris. Ralph's wife. She's the architect, isn't she? Jonathan nodded slowly. The money was used to purchase a beachfront property in Tampa 3 weeks ago. They weren't just running away. They were building a fortress on your son's grave. Tampa. A 3-bedroom house with a pool paid for in blood and forged ink. Every transaction was a deliberate step in a dance of death. The most horrifying discovery came when Jonathan opened a hidden email thread from a private server. Doris was the one who sent Bryn the research on ethylene glycol, including a PDF titled Diabetes Complication Mimicry. It was a manual for murder. This was a family business, a syndicate of 2 women, stripping the men in their lives, down to the bone. I looked at the beach house address, imagining them sipping drinks by a pool funded by my son's final agonizing breaths. Jonathan looked up from the screen, his face pale, and handed me a printed property record that felt like lead in my hands. Silas, there's one more name on the DH Management Board of Directors. He whispered, his voice trembling with a new kind of dread. It's someone you know very well. I stared at the name on the paper, the final piece of the bridge falling into place, revealing a treachery that reached even further into the heart of my family than I had dared to fear. The tapping on the basement glass wasn't rhythmic. It was the frantic, uneven code of a neighbor who had spent 3 years watching a wolf play dress-up in my family's clothes. I moved toward the sound, my shadow stretching across the damp concrete. Margaret Holloway, a 65-year-old neighbor with silver hair pulled into a no-nonsense bun, and eyes that could spot a hairline fracture from across the street, kneel in the flower bed outside my window. She looked out of place among the wilting hydrangeas, her knees pressing into the garden soil as she slid a manila folder through the narrow gap. I've been watching her parade around like she owns the block, Silas, she whispered, her voice muffled by the thick glass. She doesn't. I reached out and took the folder, feeling the gritty texture of soil on the edges. What is this, Margaret? Why go to all this trouble for a man in a cellar? I asked. She shook her head, the distant, muffled sound of a neighbor's lawnmower filling the silence between her words. She told me she had spent the last 48 hours at the county records office because something about my exile didn't sit right with her. She'd seen Bryn and Milo on the porch arguing over the old man's signature, and she knew she had to find the one paper Bryn couldn't delete. I opened the folder, the dry, papery smell hitting me instantly. The name Jonathan had mentioned, as the 3rd director of the shell company, Milo's estranged brother, stared back at me from the deed's history, confirming this was a merger of 2 predatory families. A deed is the structural drawing of a life. You can paint the walls and change the locks, but the load-bearing names never change. My eyes fixed on the certified copy of the 2012 property deed. It was all there in black and white, Silas Vance listed as a joint tenant with right of survivorship. I remembered taking out that insurance policy 12 years ago, when I put down $60,000 to help Kellen buy this Victorian. Bryn had spent months treating me like a stray dog in a guest room, making me feel like a burden in my own home. She didn't know I owned the pylons. She tried to lock me out of my own bridge. I muttered, the taste of copper and cold determination sharp on my tongue. You aren't a guest. Silas, Margaret said, her eyes boring into mine through the glass. You're the landlord. Act like it. 50%. My name. My house. My rules. As I scanned the fine print, I found a secondary clause that made my heart stop. Upon Kellen's death, his 50% share didn't automatically transfer to his wife. Instead, it reverted to a protective trust for Quinn, a trust that I was designated to manage until she reached adulthood. Bryn hadn't just failed to steal the house. She was technically living in a property controlled entirely by the man she was trying to kill. I clutched that deed to my chest, the paper crinkling like a battle flag in the dim light. The realization was a sudden, violent burst of clarity. I didn't need to wait for the exhumation to take my house back. I just needed to survive until Saturday. I looked at Margaret and nodded a silent promise between neighbors. The wolf was still in the house, but I was finally holding the keys to the cage. The last Friday of my exile felt different. The damp air of the basement no longer felt like a shroud, but like a staging ground. Shadows aren't just an absence of light. In that Victorian basement, they were the ink I used to map out the final demolition of Bryn Ashford's life. I sat in the flickering yellow glow of a single bulb, with Garrett and Margaret, our silhouettes stretching across the concrete floor, like the gears of a machine finally coming into alignment. We synchronized our watches with a clinical silence. Margaret was the guardian tasked with the most vital extraction. Garrett was the hammer waiting in the periphery to strike if the law needed a physical push. I was the bait, the aging bridge inspector, whose supposed dementia would finally lure the predators into the open. We reviewed the digital signal from the hidden cameras one last time, ensuring the play button on my laptop would bypass her local overrides. I had already made my own preparations. Earlier that evening, I had slipped into the kitchen while Bryn was upstairs, swapping the lethal contents of the blue industrial bottle under the sink with a harmless mixture of blue food coloring and salt. Any final dose she tried to force upon me tonight would be nothing more than a salty reminder of her own failure. We moved with the cold efficiency of a wrecking crew. If Milo moves, I stop him, Garrett muttered, checking the slide on his weapon with a sound that echoed like a death knell. If Bryn screams, let her. The police will be 2 blocks away, waiting for my signal. I looked at Margaret, whose hand was steady on the manila folder containing my property deed. I just want Quinn out of this house before the first word is spoken, I said, my voice like grinding stones. Saturday morning arrived with a heavy frost that felt like a shroud over the garden, turning the grass into brittle glass. Before I reveal the truth behind the nature walk, Margaret planned for my granddaughter, if you're still watching this unfold with me. Comment A if you think I should confront Bryn alone, or B if Garrett should lead the way, and add one short reason why. Please note the next part includes some fictionalized details added to deepen the emotional impact and convey the core message. If that's not for you, you're free to stop watching here. Margaret pulled her car into the driveway, the tires crunching through the frozen gravel. She was here for the park diversion, a simple ruse of ice cream and nature trails to get the only innocent soul left in this house into the light. I watched through the window as Bryn stood on the porch, waving with a performance of motherly love so perfect it made my skin crawl. She had likely practiced that exact goodbye for the day she planned to send Quinn to a boarding school and never look back. I knelt in the foyer as Quinn ran to me, her small frame shivering. "You go with Ms. Margaret Quinn," I whispered, feeling her soft, rhythmic breathing against my neck. "Don't look back at the house, okay? I'm brave like you, Pop Pop." She whispered back, her voice a tiny anchor in the storm. "I'll stay in the park until you call." The car door clicked. 1 life saved. 2 more to dismantle. I watched the taillights of Margaret's car vanish into the Ann Arbor mist. Then I turned toward the living room, where Bryn was already waiting with a smile that told me the settlement talk was about to begin. The living room felt like a courtroom, where the judge was a ghost, and the evidence was hidden in the rafters. Walking into my own living room felt like stepping into a trap I'd designed myself, a masterclass in structural irony, where the load-bearing walls were made of lies, and I was the only one who knew the roof was about to come down. I took a seat in Eleanor's old wingback chair, the fabric still holding a faint scent of the life we had shared before the rot set in. Facing me were Bryn and Milo, perched on the sofa like a royal couple surveying a conquered province. Bryn's expensive cloying perfume filled the air, a scent so thick it felt like it was trying to drown out the smell of damp Michigan earth. I sat in silence, feeling the dry, metallic taste of resolve on my tongue. "Silas, we found a lovely facility in Brighton." Bryn began, her voice dripping with a fake clinical empathy. "They specialize in cognitive decline. It's for the best, really. You need professional help that we just can't provide here." I watched Milo smirk as he checked his watch, his posture one of bored aggression. He was likely thinking about the private investor-only portal where Bryn had already listed my home. I'd seen the digital footprints. They were planning to sell the property out from under me within 48 hours. "I'm sure you have, Bryn," I replied, my voice steady as an iron beam. "But before we discuss my decline, let's discuss the house." I leaned forward and slid the manila folder onto the coffee table. The sound of the coffee table glass clicking against the folder was sharp in the quiet room. I watched her eyes scan the 2012 deed, then the forensic audit Jonathan had prepared regarding the $240,000 in fraudulent loans. I saw the flickers of shock, the rapid mental calculations before her face hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated arrogance. Have you ever looked a monster in the eye and realized she wasn't afraid of the truth because she'd spent her whole life burying it? "These are just business investments." Kellen approved. She scoffed, tossing the audit aside. "And a deed. You think a 12-year-old piece of paper protects you? I have the death certificate, Silas. I have the power of his estate. I am the grieving widow, and you are just a confused old man in a basement. I own 50% of this dirt, Bryn." I said, my pulse slow and rhythmic. "You're a trespasser in a dead man's house," she laughed. A cold, sharp sound that echoed off the family photos she hadn't managed to throw away yet. "You have nothing, Silas. No one believes you." Milo stood up, then his cold, aggressive stance looming over my chair. He reached into his pocket, and I caught the glint of a small vial, a medical sedative. He was going to end this now, forcibly restrain me, and claim I'd had a violent mental episode. The hubris in the room was suffocating. Bryn leaned forward, her eyes like two chips of ice, and whispered, "Nobody believes a confused old man, Silas. Especially not when the water he drinks is full of your son's favorite supplements. We've already made the arrangements. You're leaving today one way or another." I didn't flinch. I just looked at the grandfather clock behind her, knowing that the little glass eye was recording every word of her confession. I didn't flinch when Milo stepped into my personal space. I just reached for the zipper of the laptop bag, the sound of metal teeth parting like a final warning to the predators in my parlor. Bryn's smug smile remained plastered on her face, a mask of cold porcelain that she thought was unbreakable. She truly believed I was a senile old man playing with a toy. But as I pulled the heavy engineering laptop out and set it on the coffee table, the atmosphere in the room shifted. I hit the space bar with a deliberate click that echoed in the sudden silence. The screen flickered to life, not with a screensaver or a spreadsheet, but with a crystal-clear video feed from the cloud server. The living room was suddenly filled with the high-definition image of Bryn in the kitchen, her movements clinical and cold. On the screen, she was meticulously measuring the blue medicine into Kellen's morning coffee. Her expression one of bored indifference. "You wanted a settlement, Bryn?" I asked, my voice vibrating with a quiet, lethal fury. "Here it is. My son recorded every dose you gave him. He knew what you were doing long before he left us. Bryn's arrogance vanished instantly, replaced by a gray, waxen shock as she watched her own face on the screen humming a light tune while she sealed my son's fate. She looked like a ghost, seeing its own corpse. Milo froze his hand, still buried in his pocket, clutching the sedative he intended for me, as he realized they weren't just being accused, they were being watched by the man they murdered. "Shut it off." Bryn suddenly shrieked, her voice cracking like thin glass. "That is not real. It is a deep fake. You are a crazy old man, Silas. Have you ever watched the light of a soul go out not from death, but from the sudden crushing weight of an unavoidable truth? I watched it happen to her in real time." Her eyes darted around the room, searching for an exit that no longer existed. "This is a live stream," I added, leaning back, as the video continued to play their recorded conversations about the Florida Retirement Fund. "Every word you say right now is being broadcast directly to the district attorney's office." Milo tried to bolt for the hallway, his boots thumping against the hardwood, but he stopped dead. Garrett Vance, 42, a broad-shouldered Detroit homicide detective with eyes like flint, and my own stubborn jawline, stepped out from the dining room shadows. He held his service weapon with the steady hand of a man who had seen too much evil to let this one walk away. "Sit down, Milo," Garrett said, his voice a low growl. "You are not going to Florida. You are going to Jackson State." Bryn began a frantic psychological collapse, lunging for the laptop to smash it, but I pulled it back just in time. Bam! Garrett kicked the door shut. The trap didn't just close, it locked. The smell of ozone and Bryn's frantic, sour sweat filled the air. Outside, the rhythmic flash of blue and red lights began to pulse against the Victorian wallpaper, turning my home into a crime scene. In her absolute panic, Bryn turned and screamed at Milo. "Why didn't you use more on him? You should have used enough to stop him, like we did Kellen." She pointed a trembling finger at me, accidentally confessing to my attempted murder in front of a room full of witnesses. The front door burst open as the first officer shouted for everyone to put their hands up, and in that chaos I saw Bryn reach for the glass of supplement water she had left on the table for me. Justice doesn't always sound like a gavel. Sometimes it's the sharp, rhythmic ratcheting of steel handcuffs closing over the wrists of the woman who tried to turn my family into a bank account. The sirens weren't a scream of tragedy anymore. They were the first notes of a long overdue peace. I watched breathless as Bryn's fingers brushed the condensation on the glass of poisoned water she had prepared for me. Before she could bring it to her lips, Garrett moved with the fluid, explosive speed of the young man I used to know. He caught her wrist just inches from her face, his grip like a vice. "Not today, Bryn!" He growled, his voice vibrating with a decade of law enforcement authority. "You don't get the easy way out." With a sharp kick, Garrett sent the glass flying. The blue-tinted liquid splattered across the Persian rug like an oil slick, a chemical stain that finally exposed the rot she had hidden beneath her polite smiles. Uniformed officers flooded the room, their heavy boots thumping against the floorboards as they secured the perimeter. As they forced Bryn to her knees, an officer searched her jacket pocket and pulled out a small leather folder. Inside were 2 one-way plane tickets to Tampa dated for 8 o'clock that evening. She wasn't just planning to institutionalize me. She was planning to vanish the moment I was locked away. "Get your hands off me." Bryn shrieked, her face shifting into a primal, snarling mask of hatred. "Silas is crazy. He's senile. Check the basement, he's probably got bodies down there." Her desperation was a foul thing to witness a cornered predator, realizing the cage was finally hers. I stood back against the mantel, my legs beginning to shake as the adrenaline finally started to break. leaving a bitter metallic taste in the back of my throat. A house is like a bridge. Once you remove the rot and the rust, the whole structure begins to breathe again, finding its balance in the wind. I could feel the house exhaling as Milo was pinned against the wall nearby. His bravado had evaporated into a silent, sweating terror. He looked at Garrett, then at the laptop still playing the loop of their betrayal, and he simply collapsed inward. I walked toward the front porch, needing the cold, bracing autumn air to hit my lungs. On the sidewalk, I saw Margaret Holloway, 68, a sharp-eyed retiree and the neighborhood's unofficial historian who had been my friend since we bought our first houses, standing on her lawn. She was joined by a dozen other neighbors, a silent jury witnessing the fall of the woman who had tried to play them all for fools. The rhythmic pulsing of blue and red lights washed over the oak trees and the Victorian facade, turning the street into a theater of consequences. As the officers led Bryn down the stairs, she used to walk with such performative grace, she locked eyes with me one last time. "You're going to rot in that basement, you old bastard," she spat. I leaned against the railing, feeling miraculously light. "No, Bryn," I said quietly. "I'm going to sleep in my own bed tonight. You're the one going to the cellar now." The sirens wail. It wasn't an alarm anymore. It was a victory song. One of the responding officers, a young man with a notepad, stepped up to me. "We checked the chemicals in the kitchen, sir. It looks like Milo was already under investigation for industrial theft. The medicine he gave her was stolen from his construction site's winter inventory industrial-grade anti-freeze compounds." As the squad car door slammed shut on Bryn's face, I looked up at the attic window and saw a single small hand pressed against the glass. The silence that followed the sirens was the loudest thing I'd ever heard, a heavy pressure that sat in my lungs until we pulled through the gates of Pine Ridge Cemetery 3 days later. The morning mist clung to the headstones like a cold, wet shroud, as if the earth itself was reluctant to give up the secrets I'd spent months trying to unearth. I stood by the iron fence, my hands deep in my overcoat pockets, watching the yellow backhoe bite into the soil where Kellen had rested for only 4 short months. The rhythmic thud of the machinery felt like a pulse in my own temples, a mechanical heartbeat replacing the one Bryn stole from my boy. I looked down at the base of the headstone and noticed the bouquet of lilies Bryn had supposedly left weeks ago. I reached down, touching a petal, only to find it was rigid, cheap plastic. I lifted the bundle and realized they were weighted with lead at the base. It was a final, perfect metaphor for her hollow artificial and designed to stay exactly where she put it. "It's the only way," Silas Garrett said, standing beside me in a dark wool coat. "The lab needs the tissue samples to prove the ethylene glycol levels. The DA won't go to trial on a video alone." "I know, Garrett," I replied, my voice sounding thin in the damp air. "But it feels like I'm letting her kill him all over again." Watching that earth move felt like a betrayal of the peace I'd promised him at the funeral. I stood there, a retired engineer who had spent a lifetime building things to last, forced to watch the deconstruction of my own son's rest. How many times had I checked the structural integrity of a bridge, only to realize I'd forgotten to look at the very ground it was built upon. I had missed the erosion beneath my own roof until the pillars began to crumble. The diesel exhaust from the backhoe mixed with the scent of wet clay, a bitter perfume that signaled the end of the facade. The workers finally reached the concrete vault, the sound of metal scraping stone making my teeth ache. The cable snapped taut. The earth groaned. The past was rising. As the crane began to lift the casket from the dark rectangular hole in the mist, I stepped forward. I pulled a single white lily from my pocket, its petals soft and velvet against my calloused thumb. This one was real. It was the same kind Eleanor used to plant in the garden Kellen loved so much as a boy. I waited until the box was level with the grass. Then I laid the flower on the lid. "I'm bringing you home soon, Kellen," I whispered. "Rest easy for just a little longer." "He's going to tell us everything now," Silas Garrett said, placing a steadying hand on my shoulder as the coroner's van backed up. But as the workers shifted the vault to the transport trolley, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Tucked under the lip of the vault's outer rim was a small waterproof black box with a blinking green light. It was a GPS tracker. I pointed it out to Garrett, who pulled it free with a gloved hand. Milo hadn't just been watching me. He had been monitoring the grave itself to see if anyone disturbed the evidence. I watched the van drive away with my son's remains, but my eyes stayed glued to the tracker in Garrett's hand, wondering who else had been watching this grave from the shadows. A confession in a concrete cell has a specific sound. It is the dry, rattling noise of a man realizing that loyalty is a luxury he can no longer afford while facing a life sentence. The walk back to the station from the cemetery felt lighter, as if the weight of the dirt we'd moved had been lifted from my own chest, but the metallic, cold taste of finality still sat on my tongue. I sat in the police station break room, the air thick with the smell of burnt station coffee and the low hum of distant scanners. Garrett walked in, looking older than he had that morning, but his eyes were clear. He sat across from me and set his badge on the table with a weary sigh. He sang like a bird, Silas. He set his voice low. Milo Redmond didn't even wait for the full lab results. The moment he knew we had the exhumation order and that GPS tracker, he realized the architecture of his lies was falling. He didn't just confess to his own part. He traded Bryn's head for a plea deal. I learned then that Milo had been recording his phone calls with Bryn for months as a paranoid failsafe. He gave the detectives the digital keys to shell accounts and secret recordings that provided a literal roadmap of their premeditation. He was more afraid of Bryn double-crossing him than he was of the cuffs. It turns out, the tracker on the grave was his way of making sure she didn't try to move the body or hide evidence without him knowing. "Paranoia is a hell of a motivator," I whispered, staring into my black coffee. "Evil isn't a solid wall. It is a series of interlocking beams, and once you pull the primary bolt, the whole structure loses its ability to stand against the wind." I watched the structure collapse in real time as a blue, flickering glow from the television in the corner caught my eye. A breaking news alert flashed across the screen, showing a sun-drenched street in Florida. Federal agents were leading an older woman out of a beachfront home. It was Doris Hargrove, Bryn's mother. The Florida property bought with the stolen $240,000 from my son's estate was being seized as a criminal asset. "They got Doris," Garrett said, gesturing to the screen. The money trail led straight to her kitchen table in Tampa. I watched her pale face as they put her in the car, and I felt no pity. She wasn't just a mother Garrett. She was the CEO of a family business built on coffins. Flash. The camera lights in Tampa didn't blink. Neither did I. The systematic dismantling of the Ashford-Redmond network was happening before my eyes, and the generational harvest of their poison was finally over. Garrett leaned forward, his expression darkening with a new piece of information. The federal audit revealed that Doris had successfully pulled this exact scheme twice before with previous sons-in-law in other states. That's why she was so clinical. Kellen wasn't just a victim. He was a repeat performance. The depth of the depravity made my stomach churn, but the legal weight was finally settling. Garrett slid a final document across the table, a sharp, clinical sound of paper sliding across wood. It was a letter from the district attorney, As I read the first line, I realized the legal battle was over, but the hardest walk of my life was still ahead of me. Paper has a weight that has nothing to do with grams or ounces. As I stared at the folder on the desk, I knew the ink inside carried the final, undeniable gravity of my son's murder. The bridge didn't look like a crime scene anymore. It just looked like a path home. But first I had to navigate the stale air and the smell of floor wax in the municipal building. De Miller, a man whose skin looked like weathered saddle leather and whose eyes held the weary weight of 1,000 convictions, sat behind a desk piled high with the sins of the city. He didn't offer a handshake, just a somber nod that felt more appropriate for the occasion. Garrett and I sat across from him, the cold mahogany of the desk unyielding beneath my palms. Miller slid the finalized toxicology report across the wood. It was a sharp, clinical white against the dark grain. I opened the first page, my eyes scanning the dense columns of chemical jargon, until I reached the highlighted sections. The lab results were staggering. The report indicated that Kellen's tissue samples showed lethal concentrations of ethylene glycol and its metabolite glycolic acid. The lab didn't just find a trace, Silas Miller said, his voice as dry as the paper. They found a reservoir. He was being saturated with it. The letter from the DA accompanying the report added a terrifying layer. The toxicology screen from my own recent blood work showed traces of the same poison. I was sitting there, a living witness to my own attempted murder, feeling the phantom burn of the coffee Bryn had served me. This isn't just a homicide case anymore, Miller continued. It is first degree with special circumstances. There is no plea deal for this. Science is the ultimate bridge inspector. It doesn't care about the aesthetic of the paint or the charm of the architect. It only cares about the integrity of the steel. In this office, the steel was the molecular reality of my son's cells. Miller detailed how these results effectively dismantled Bryn's pathetic defense about diabetic complications. She thought she was clever using his insulin as a cover, but she didn't realize chemistry doesn't lie. The presence of calcium oxalate crystals in the kidney tissue provided a permanent physical fingerprint of the antifreeze. No lawyer could argue away those microscopic jagged edges. Lethal, not just once, but dozens of times over. She didn't just kill him, she harvested him. The realization made the metallic taste of lingering shock rise in my throat. I looked at Garrett, whose jaw was set in a hard line. We have enough for a grand jury by Monday. Miller said, the sound of a heavy stapler punching through the report punctuating his words like a gavel. She is never seeing the sun as a free woman again. The scientific proof was cemented, locking her into a cage of her own making. The report also noted that the ethylene glycol had been mixed with a specific strawberry kiwi flavor enhancer found in the expensive protein shakes Bryn drank every morning. It proved she was the only person with access to the delivery method. Miller closed the folder with a definitive snap, but then he looked at me with a soft, pitying expression. I felt a cold prickle of dread. There's one more thing, Silas, he said quietly, about the insulin vials we recovered from the trash. My breath hitched in my chest as the silence in the room became absolute. The trial had been scheduled for mid-January 2026, 14 months after the October 2024 arrest, giving the prosecution ample time to build an ironclad case against Bryn Ashford. The walk back to the bridge felt like the final inspection of a lifetime. But that bridge began here in the cold, stagnant air of the county courthouse. The trial of Bryn Ashford had transformed from a local tragedy into a public spectacle. The gallery packed with people who had come to watch a perfect life unravel. Defense attorney Holloway, a man who smelled of expensive cologne and cheap ethics, was a shark in a three-piece suit who viewed the truth as a negotiable commodity. He spent 3 hours trying to dismantle my credibility, pacing the floorboards with a practiced predatory gait. "Isn't it true, Mr. Vance, that you were found wandering your own basement in a state of confusion just days before the arrest?" he asked, leaning in until I could see the blue light of the court reporter's monitor reflected in his glasses. I didn't flinch. "I was wandering, counselor, because your client had turned my home into a laboratory of slow-motion homicide," I replied, my voice calm under the pressure. "Holloway tried to introduce a surprise witness, a man claiming I had been violent and erratic for years. However, the prosecutor was ready. The man was revealed to be the younger brother of Milo Redmond, and Judge Myra Thorne threw the testimony out for a blatant conflict of interest. Judge Thorne, a woman with a voice like grinding gravel and eyes that had seen every lie the city of Detroit had to offer, sat atop the bench like a secular deity, her expression unreadable as she watched the defense's strategy crumble. A courtroom is like a stress test for a bridge. It doesn't matter how pretty the architecture is if the rivets of the truth are missing. I sat through the barrage of slurs against my mind, watching Bryn dab at dry eyes in a performance of the grieving widow that once would have fooled me. Now, seeing the way she checked the camera angles between sobs, it only made my stomach turn. The jury didn't buy the act either. They returned in less than 4 hours, their faces like stone as they took their seats. Guilty. The word echoed like a bolt snapping in an empty canyon. It was followed by the same word count after count, until the air in the room felt heavy with the finality of it. The rhythmic, heavy sound of the gavel hitting the block punctuated the end of the Ashford-Redmond legacy. Judge Thorne looked directly at Bryn as she delivered the sentencing remarks. "Your crimes were not born of passion, but of a calculated mechanical cruelty that this court finds abhorrent," she stated. When she pronounced life without the possibility of parole, I felt the phantom weight of the basement ceiling finally lift off my shoulders. I stood for my impact statement, looking past the weeping Bryn to the cameras. I informed the court that I was donating the entirety of the recovered $240,000 to a foundation for elder abuse victims. Bryn's mother would never see a cent of her Florida fund. "Take her down," the judge ordered. As they led her away, Bryn looked back at me, the mask of the victim finally gone, replaced by a smile so empty it made me realize the real monster wasn't the poison. It was the woman who had no soul left to poison. The bridge didn't look like a crime scene anymore. It just looked like a path home. But as I stood before the heavy oak door of the Victorian, the copper key felt cold against my palm, a heavy physical reminder that the house was finally silent, but no longer under the protection of yellow tape. I stepped across the threshold, and the first thing I felt wasn't victory. It was a hollow, clinical chill. I realized then that the house didn't feel like home yet. It felt like a museum of things I barely survived, a collection of artifacts from a war I hadn't quite finished fighting. The physical presence of Bryn was gone, her expensive perfumes and calculated smiles scrubbed away. But the Ashford-Redmond shadow still lurked in the corners of the ceiling. I moved through the rooms with a sense of grim duty, clearing out the last of the legal binders and the scattered remnants of the audit. "It's just a house again," I told myself, my voice sounding small against the clicking of the radiator. "We're safe now." But as the December wind rattled the window panes, I knew safety and peace were two very different animals. I began the somber task of preparing for Christmas, dragging dusty cardboard boxes from the hall closet. The smell of stale pine needles from last year's wreaths filled the air, a scent that usually brought joy, but now only tasted like ash. I stood in the parlor, paralyzed by the sight of the empty corner where Kellen and I used to set the tree. This was the year of firsts, and I wasn't ready for any of them. The silence wasn't golden. It was deafening. I looked toward the small bassinet near the fire, where the baby lay sleeping, a child born from the very darkness I had spent months exposing. I walked to the mantel and ran my fingers over the guardianship papers, the ink still fresh. "I won't let them touch you," I whispered, a fierce, protective heat rising in my chest. "I hope you have your father's eyes, Kellen, and none of the ice that ran through your mother's veins." I reached into a box labeled Decorations and found my hands trembling as I pulled out a single strand of flickering lights. How many more secrets are buried under these floorboards? The question haunted me, a structural flaw in my newfound stability that I couldn't ignore. I reached the bottom of the box and felt something that didn't belong, a heavy padded envelope addressed to me in Kellen's precise architectural script. A notification from the concierge service attached to it explained it was a timed delivery gift set up over a year ago. My heart began to hammer against my ribs as I realized this was his final move from beyond the grave. This wasn't just a holiday greeting. It was a legacy. I sat in my old armchair, the dusty texture of the cardboard box still on my fingers, and stared at the envelope. I found a letter inside that suggested Kellen knew the Ashford Redmonds were circling like vultures long before the accident ever happened. He had seen the cracks in the bridge before I ever did. As I broke the wax seal on Kellen's letter, the date at the top stopped my heart. It was written 6 months before he died, and the first line was an apology. "I am sorry for the silence, Silas. I am sorry for the distance, but I had to make sure you were never a target." The first sentence of the letter burned in my mind the next morning as I gripped the handle of a sledgehammer. The 10-pound weight felt lighter than it should have, a metallic cure for the memories vibrating through my arms and into my teeth. Kellen's apology wasn't just for a secret kept in the shadows. It was a map to a physical legacy he had buried within the very structure of this house. Reclaiming this Victorian meant more than just healing. It was a scavenger hunt for a truth he had died protecting. I spent the early hours in the upper hallway tearing down the floral wallpaper Bryn had meticulously chosen. Every strip of that gaudy pattern felt like peeling away a layer of the Ashford Redmond lies, exposing the clean, honest plaster underneath. "It has to go." I muttered, the grit of the adhesive under my fingernails a welcome irritation. "All of it." "I'm sorry too, Kellen, but I have to finish this." The frantic energy of the morning was the only way to drown out the echoes of his written voice. By noon, the upper floor was a wasteland of paper scraps and dust. But the house felt like it was finally beginning to breathe again. Reclaiming the bones of the building was a prerequisite for making sense of the cryptic pages he'd left behind. Sweat sting, dust chokes. My past is under my fingernails. I moved the renovation to the basement after lunch, trading the scraper for the sledgehammer. My plan was to build Quinn a workshop, a sanctuary, where she could create without the fear that had defined her father's final months. Quinn sat on the third step from the bottom, her elbows on her knees, watching me with a solemnity that mirrored her father's. Her presence was a stabilizing force against the mounting mystery of the letter. We spread the original yellowed blueprints out on an old workbench, the edges curling like dried leaves. "Do you think she'd like it down here?" I asked, gesturing to the open space. Quinn nodded slowly, her eyes tracking the lines on the paper. She always liked the quiet. I ran the measuring tape along the back wall, the metallic snap echoing in the cavernous room. I paused, frowning at the numbers. The blueprints indicated a solid retaining wall, but the physical measurements were off. There was a 4-foot gap behind this drywall that didn't match the architectural record. The house was a body, and I was performing the autopsy it deserved. I swung the hammer. The first impact sent a cloud of chalky drywall dust into the air, the taste of it thick on my tongue. With 3 more rhythmic thuds, the studs splintered, and the wall gave way. A cold draft smelling of old ozone and oil rushed out from the hidden space. I pulled away the remaining boards, the metallic tang of old nails biting into the air. My heart stopped. Behind the false wall sat a complex arrangement of polished steel and circuitry, a prototype of a device Quinn recognized immediately. It wasn't a failure, and it hadn't burned in any lab fire. It was the finished version of the project Kellen had supposedly died, failing to complete. Quinn dropped the measuring tape, her face turning the color of the drywall dust, as she stared at the machine behind the studs. I watched Quinn reach out her fingers, trembling as they hovered just inches from the cold, brushed steel of the prototype. The basement was silent, save for the sound of our ragged breathing and the settling of the house above us. For a moment the world felt suspended in that narrow gap between the drywall and the truth. I left the basement ghost behind, trading the scent of drywall dust for the sharp, cold bite of wet earth in my mind. But first I needed to settle a different debt. I led Quinn upstairs, leaving the machine in its dark sanctuary for now. The kitchen was flooded with the pale, honest light of a spring morning, and I sat at the table where a shattered memory waited for me. For weeks I had been working in the quiet hours, my hands steady, despite the grief meticulously aligning the fibers of the photograph Bryn had shredded in her last fit of spite. The tacky feel of Scotch tape clung to my fingertips as I pressed the final transparent sliver over the center of the image. Kellen's face was finally whole again. The creases remained running through his jaw and across his brow like silver scars, but his eyes were clear. "You are back," I whispered the words, catching in my throat. "We are going to finish what you started, son. But first, we are going to live." As I smoothed the surface of the mended frame, my heart skipped. I looked closer at the background behind Kellen's smiling form. He was standing on the sidewalk of this very street, the unmistakable turret of our Victorian home rising behind him. The photo was dated 4 years before we ever signed the deed. We hadn't found this house by accident. He had chosen it for us long before the shadows closed in. How much of our life was a coincidence and how much was a blueprint? I felt a surge of righteously angry resolve. He had been protecting us from the start, building a fortress under the guise of a family home. I stood up and called for Quinn. It was time to reclaim the land. We went into the backyard, the air smelling of damp mulch and the promise of rain. I carried the young cherry tree, its root ball heavy and wrapped in burlap, while Quinn shouldered the shovels. We walked to the exact center of the yard, the dead patch of grass, where the Ashford-Redmond surveillance van had sat for months, poisoning our peace. I drove the blade into the earth, with a rhythmic force, my muscles burning with a cathartic release. The shovel was a surgeon's tool, cutting out the rot of the last 2 years. Quinn worked beside me in silence, the two of us digging deep into the dark soil. I imagined the pink hue of the cherry blossoms to be a vibrant middle finger to the gray men who had watched us from the dark. "It will bloom in 3 years, I told her, wiping sweat from my forehead. Quinn nodded, her face finally losing that pinched look of terror. "I think the house likes the company," she replied. I leaned into the final strike, intending to clear the last of the hard clay. My shovel did not ring with the sound of stone. It shrieked against steel. The vibration traveled up the wooden handle, rattling my teeth. I knelt, brushing away the loose dirt with my bare hands. It wasn't a pipe or a rock. My fingers caught the edge of a heavy rusted lid, a locked box that had been waiting for the roots to go deep enough. I didn't use the key. I didn't have to, as the lock had rusted away, surrendering its secrets to the damp April soil. My fingers brushed against the grit and cold metal of the box, and with a sharp tug, the lid groaned open. Inside, tucked within a heavy-duty waterproof pouch, lay the answer to the questions that had kept me awake for 1,000 nights. The smell of fresh rain and turned earth filled my lungs as I pulled out a bundle of papers. It wasn't a technical manual or a legal threat. It was the crinkle of aged parchment that greeted me bearing the elegant, precise handwriting of Eleanor Kellen's mother. I sat back on my heels in the garden, the newly planted cherry tree standing over me like a silent sentinel. Quinn knelt beside me, her eyes wide as I began to read the letter aloud. It was a confession born of a love she had desperately tried to shield from the suffocating influence of the Ashford-Redmond Empire. She revealed that she was the one who funded the purchase of this Victorian home through an anonymous trust, ensuring Kellen had a fortress she could never be seen visiting. She had used her own family's wealth to build a cage of safety around us, hidden from his father's prying eyes. The letter detailed how she helped Kellen stage his supposed failures, creating a trail of technical dead ends and academic disappointments to keep his true brilliance out of his father's reach. "He wasn't running away from us, Quinn," I said, my voice thick with a deep, cathartic release. "He was building a wall around us. Eleanor knew everything, and she had played the long game alongside her son. Do you know what it feels like when a haunting finally ends? It's not a scream. It's a sigh." We stayed in the yard until the light began to fail, the wind through the cherry branches, whispering secrets we finally understood. Later that evening, the house felt fundamentally different. The oppressive weight that had sat on my chest since the accident was simply gone. I walked through the halls, no longer checking for shadows or listening for the footsteps of intruders. The old floorboard creaks that once sounded like warnings were now just the house settling into its bones. I entered the nursery and stood over the crib, watching the rhythmic breathing of the sleeping baby. The soft glow of the nightlight cast a warm, amber hue over the room, highlighting a peace I hadn't thought possible. The darkness didn't claw at the windows tonight. It just watched like a tired dog. I realized that the nightmares of fire and poison that had plagued me were not waiting for me in the pillow. I checked the locks out of habit, but for the first time I did it with a smile rather than a shudder. "Sleep well, little one," I whispered, resting a hand on the rail. "We're finally home." As I retreated to my own room, I noticed a low, nearly imperceptible vibration in the air. It wasn't the hum of an appliance or the wind in the eaves. The haunting I had felt wasn't the Ashford-Redmond's malice at all. It was a security system Kellen had integrated into the house's frequency, a protective hum that only sinks when the family is safe. As I drifted into the first dreamless sleep in years, I realized the house wasn't just standing anymore. It was breathing with us, a living legacy of a man who loved us enough to disappear. Sunlight didn't just filter through the windows this morning. It claimed the space, burning away the last of the stagnant shadows that had lived here since Kellen left. I woke up with my hand resting on the mended photo on the bedside table, the tape seams feeling like braille beneath my thumb. The peace I felt was thick, a physical presence that had replaced the jagged edge of constant vigilance. As I prepared breakfast, I realized the 128kV7 project wasn't just a machine hidden behind a basement wall. It was a digital kill switch that had officially scrubbed our existence from the Ashford-Redmond databases, making us invisible to them forever. The haunting frequency of the house had finalized its sequence, and the men in the black SUVs would find nothing but ghosts and empty data packets if they ever looked for us again. I gathered Quinn and the baby, feeling the weight of the little one in the carrier against my chest, a solid reminder of what we had fought to keep. We stepped out of the house into the crisp, early March air of 2026, the late winter sun finally burning away the last shadows of our 17-month nightmare. For the first time in 2 years, I didn't look over my shoulder. I didn't scan the tree line for lenses or check the street for unfamiliar tires. We began the walk toward the suspension bridge that overlooks the valley, our boots crunching on the trail. We talked about the future, but the conversation had shifted. It wasn't a survival plan anymore. It was a life. We discussed how to release the benevolent parts of Kellen's technology to the public, ensuring it served the world as he intended, rather than being hoarded by the monsters who tried to break him. We aren't hiding anymore, are we? Quinn asked, her voice steady as she matched my stride. No, I told her, looking out over the rolling green of the valley. We're just living. The war is over. The silence is ours. It is a strange, beautiful thing to realize that the person you were before the tragedy is gone, replaced by someone who knows the exact value of a quiet afternoon. It was March 5th, 2026, exactly 17 months since the nightmare began in that cold October basement. The cool wind whipped over the bridge, carrying the distant sound of the river rushing below us. I looked at Quinn, seeing the young woman she was becoming, and then down at the sleeping baby. Dignity isn't something that was stolen from us. It was something we forged in the furnace of the last 2 years. The bridge beneath my feet felt like a sturdy path we had already crossed, leaving the trauma on the far bank. He would be proud of the house, Quinn said, leaning against the railing. I knotted my throat tight with a mix of grief and triumphant peace. He would be proud of us. I pulled my hand from my pocket, the smooth gold of my wedding ring catching the dying light. I turned my hand, and as the orange rays hit the band at a perfect angle, I saw it a tiny, precise inscription on the underside I had never noticed before. Always home. It was Kellen's final message etched into the very symbol of our family. I turned my hand in the light. The tiny words inside the gold band, glowing like a promise kept from beyond the grave. And for the first time, I didn't need to wonder what came next. Looking back on everything that happened, I realized this family story was never just about crime money or revenge. It was about blindness. I spent decades inspecting bridges for hidden fractures, yet I ignored the cracks forming inside my own home. If you take anything from this family story, let it be this: never surrender your voice just to keep peace. Ask questions. Protect your dignity, your finances, and the people who depend on you. Some people call what happened to me dad revenge, but the truth is more complicated. This dad revenge was never about hatred. It was about survival and about honoring the son I lost. Still, every act of dad revenge comes with a cost. When family breaks, something inside you breaks too. That is the quiet truth behind this family story. And it is why I say, don't make the same mistake I did. Pay attention sooner. Speak up sooner. Through this family story, I also learned that justice doesn't always arrive quickly, but it does arrive when truth refuses to stay buried. I believe God watches over the broken places in our lives, even when we feel completely alone. So if this family story leaves you with one lesson, it is this: guard your home, your heart, and your independence. Evil often hides behind familiar faces, but courage can still rebuild what betrayal tried to destroy. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this journey. I'd truly like to hear your thoughts. What would you do if you were in Silas's position, facing betrayal from inside your own family? Share your perspective in the comments. If this story moved you, consider subscribing so you won't miss future stories like this. A gentle note: While inspired by real social issues, such as elder abuse and family betrayal, certain elements in this story were dramatized for storytelling purposes. If this type of content isn't for you, feel free to explore other videos that might suit your interests better. 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 Interests better.